Your kid doesn't belong here.
the board president said, her voice sharp enough to slice through the packed auditorium. This academy has standards, and sometimes scholarships are mistakes. They told the maintenance worker his kid didn't belong in that STEM academy. Then the board president doubled down, calling the scholarship a mistake in front of packed seats. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. Beneath the polished wood podium and donor banners, this wasn't about grades, it was about class, about who gets to sit in which chair. He didn't argue, he just looked up at the ceiling like he was calculating something. Because minutes from now, the same room that judged him would depend on him. This is about who gets to decide where a child belongs. Before I show you the exact moment the newly renovated auditorium started failing above their heads, you need to understand how quiet a man can become when he's pushed too far. He stood near the back row at first, oil still faint on his cuffs, boots dusted with plaster from a pipe repair that afternoon. Marcus Vale didn't carry himself like a man begging for approval. He carried himself like someone measuring exits. His shoulders were relaxed, chin slightly lifted, eyes steady, not defiant, not ashamed. Just observant. On stage, Evelyn Whitmore adjusted her tailored blazer as if the fabric itself confirmed authority. As school board president, she'd built a reputation on exclusivity. Her words came polished, rehearsed, delivered for maximum effect. "We can't compromise excellence," she continued, "not even for sympathetic circumstances." A few parents nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably. Somewhere near the aisle, a phone camera lifted discreetly. Marcus walked forward when his name was called. The echo of his boots on the auditorium floor seemed louder than it should have been. He didn't rush, didn't plead. He placed his daughter's acceptance letter carefully on the table before the board, smoothing its folded edge with calloused fingers. Lena sat in the second row, robotics team jacket zipped to her chin. Her knuckles were white around the strap of her backpack. She kept her eyes on him, searching his face for cracks. There weren't any. "You're saying," he began quietly, voice steady, "that her test scores weren't earned?" Whitmore's smile tightened. "I'm saying this environment demands more than raw scores. It demands fit. Fit." The word hung there, soft but loaded. A murmur rolled through the room like distant thunder. The principal, Dr. Eliza Romero, shifted in her seat at the far end of the table. She didn't meet Marcus's eyes. Conflict flickered across her face before she lowered her gaze to the documents in front of her. He nodded once, absorbing the blow without flinching. A single fluorescent light above the stage flickered briefly, barely noticeable. His eyes lifted to it instinctively, then scanned along the metal rigging that framed the ceiling. Subtle vibration hummed through the beams, a sensation most people would mistake for nerves. "Mr. Vale," Whitmore pressed, impatience creeping into her tone, "do you have anything further to add?" The air felt heavier now, thick with perfume and polished wood, and something else, something metallic beneath it all. Marcus exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he said, "I do." Lena leaned forward. "You're wrong about my daughter," he continued, "but that's not the worst mistake being made tonight." Brows furrowed, a few whispers sparked. Whitmore stiffened. "This hearing is about your child's placement, not—" A faint creak interrupted her. Not loud, just a subtle shift above the lights. Marcus's head tilted again, calculating angles, weight distribution, timing. His calm wasn't resignation, it was assessment. "I'm not asking for sympathy," he said evenly. "I'm asking you to look at facts." Outside, wind rattled against the tall windows of the renovated wing. The building had been showcased as Whitmore's crowning achievement, a multi-million-dollar modernization funded by her development firm's partnerships. Banners near the entrance boasted innovation, safety, structural excellence. Another flicker. This time, longer. Someone near the back laughed nervously. Probably just wiring, they whispered. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Lena watched him instead of the stage now. She'd seen that look before, when a kitchen cabinet hinge was about to give, when a gas line hissed wrong, when something invisible shifted out of place. It was the look that meant he already knew the problem before anyone else admitted it existed. Whitmore leaned forward, fingers steepled. The board will now proceed with the vote regarding revocation of the scholarship. The word revocation seemed to scrape across the floor. Marcus glanced once more at the ceiling, then at the side walls where the new steel supports met older brick. His breathing stayed steady, but his eyes sharpened. In the silence before the first vote was cast, another low groan rippled through the beams overhead. Deeper this time, like metal adjusting under pressure. Several heads turned upward. Whitmore frowned. Can someone check that sound? A maintenance supervisor near the door hesitated, scanning the room until his eyes landed on Marcus. For the first time that night, the board president noticed where he was looking, and the room began to feel smaller. The low groan in the beams faded just enough for doubt to creep back into the crowd. People shifted in their seats, embarrassed by their own nerves. A donor near the aisle let out a tight laugh. "Brand new renovations," he muttered, probably settling. Whitmore straightened behind the podium. "We are not interrupting a formal vote over building acoustics," she said crisply. "Mr. Vale, please return to your seat." He didn't move. His eyes tracked the ceiling again, then the stage rigging, then the light trusses bolted along the renovated seam where old brick met new steel. The vibration was faint, but wrong. Too rhythmic to be random. "It's not acoustics," he said quietly. A few parents glanced at him, irritated. One whispered, "He's maintenance, right?" The maintenance supervisor near the exit shifted uneasily. He'd worked alongside Marcus long enough to recognize that tone. It wasn't panic, it was calculation. Whitmore exhaled sharply. "You're out of order." Marcus turned his head slightly toward Lena. She was standing now without realizing it, robotics jacket half-zipped, eyes wide. He gave her the smallest nod. "Stay calm." Then he looked back at the board. "The west support line above the lighting grid," he said evenly. "It's under uneven load. That flicker wasn't wiring, it's tension." Silence stretched. Whitmore's lips pressed thin. "This building passed inspection. By a third-party firm contracted by your office," he replied. "No heat, just fact." A murmur rippled again, this one different. From the rear of the auditorium, a sharper metallic snap echoed, not loud enough to shatter calm, but loud enough to erase laughter. Heads jerked upward. Dr. Romero stood halfway from her seat. "What was that?" Marcus was already moving. He didn't rush wildly. He walked with purpose toward the side aisle, eyes never leaving the ceiling beams. "We need to redistribute weight from the center section," he called, voice carrying without shouting. "Clear the first 5 rows, slowly, no running." Whitmore stared after him. "You can't just take control of—" Another creak cut her off, deeper now. The maintenance supervisor hurried to Marcus's side. "What do you need?" "Kill non-essential power to the stage grid," Marcus said. "Now, and get the fire marshal on standby." The supervisor didn't argue. He ran. Parents began standing, confused, clutching purses and children. Marcus stepped onto the edge of the stage, scanning the load-bearing junction. The new steel plates were slightly misaligned where they'd been anchored into older masonry. The wind outside pressed against the glass facade of the renovated wing, amplifying the stress. Whitmore's voice rang out, sharper now. Everyone remained calm. There is no confirmed danger. But even she was looking up. Marcus turned toward the first rows. Walk. Don't crowd the exits, he instructed. You're spread out along the side walls. His authority wasn't loud, it was steady. People responded before realizing they had. Lena moved with the others, heart hammering. She didn't look scared of the building, she looked scared for him. The stage lights flickered again, then dimmed as the maintenance supervisor cut auxiliary power. The hum shifted pitch. Marcus crouched near the base of a side column, pressing his palm against the steel. He closed his eyes for half a second, feeling vibration through bone. Too much lateral sway. He stood. We need to reduce center mass immediately, he said to Romero, who'd stepped down from the board table. If that joint fails, it cascades. Her voice trembled. Can it? Yes? One word. Honest. Whitmore descended from the stage at last, heels clicking too loudly in the tense quiet. You're causing panic, she hissed. This is irresponsible. He met her gaze, finally. What's irresponsible is ignoring a load imbalance because it's inconvenient. Another metallic pop sounded overhead. Gasps spread. The fire alarm hadn't triggered. The inspectors weren't here. The donors were watching. Cameras were still recording. Marcus stepped toward the central aisle. Open the rear service doors, he instructed the supervisor returning from the breaker panel. Increase airflow. It'll relieve pressure variance. You can't issue commands, Whitmore snapped. But no one was listening to her now. Parents were ushering children toward side corridors. Ushers followed Marcus's hand signals without question. Even security deferred. Whitmore's composure fractured for the first time. Is this actually dangerous? She demanded of Romero. The principal looked between them, between title and competence. I don't know. Marcus did. He moved back toward the stage rigging access ladder. Keep people moving, he said. I'm checking the upper joint. Lena's voice broke through the chaos. Dad. He glanced back. Just once. I've got it, he said gently. And then he climbed. Steel groaned above him as wind battered the exterior glass. The auditorium no longer felt like a monument to prestige. It felt like a structure under stress. Halfway up the ladder, Marcus paused, studying the warped seam where new metal met old brick. A single anchor bolt had begun to shear under uneven distribution. Below, Whitmore stood frozen, realization dawning too slowly. The scholarship vote was forgotten. This wasn't about belonging anymore, it was about survival. And for the first time that night, the room understood exactly who they needed. Marcus reached the top of the rigging access and braced one boot against the narrow catwalk. The steel vibrated under his weight, not violently, but enough to confirm what his instincts had already calculated. Below him, the auditorium had shifted from polished ceremony to controlled chaos. Parents clustered along the side walls just as he'd directed. Security guards held doors open. The maintenance supervisor barked into a radio, voice tight but steady. Another sharp groan rippled through the upper joint. He leaned in close to the seam where the new support beam had been anchored into older masonry. The anchor bolt wasn't just shearing. It had been misaligned during installation. The torque load was uneven, transferring strain into the adjacent plate. Under normal conditions, it might have held for months. Add wind pressure in a packed auditorium, and the math changed. Auxiliary power's down, the supervisor called from below. Good, Marcus replied, not looking away from the joint. Keep the center clear. His hands moved with quiet precision, checking the tension with the edge of a wrench clipped to his belt. He carried tools the way some men carried habits, without thinking. The small steel wrench Lena had slipped into his hand weeks ago for good luck was still there, scuffed but reliable. Below, Evelyn Whitmore stood near the podium, color drained from her face. The donors she'd impressed minutes earlier were now whispering urgently. Cameras remained raised, but the narrative had shifted. Dr. Romero stepped forward into the aisle. "Is it stabilizing?" she called up. "Not yet," he answered. "If that anchor fails completely, the grid drops on the front rows." A collective breath sucked inward across the room. Whitmore swallowed. "How does this happen in a certified renovation?" she demanded, though her voice lacked its earlier steel. Marcus didn't respond to the accusation embedded in the question. He focused instead on the structure. "Who signed off on the West Wing load distribution?" he asked evenly. The maintenance supervisor hesitated. "Primary contract was Whitmore Development." The words landed heavier than the groan overhead. Evelyn stiffened. "We followed all inspection protocols." He tightened the wrench carefully against a secondary stabilizer, buying time. "Protocols don't override physics," he said. A fresh vibration rattled through the grid. The wind outside surged again, rain beginning to pepper the tall glass panes of the renovated facade. The storm had rolled in faster than forecast. The building wasn't designed for that combination of stress under maximum interior occupancy. Marcus glanced down at Lena. She stood near the side corridor, hands clasped together, refusing to leave. "Go outside," he called gently. She shook her head once. His jaw flexed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he adjusted his stance and examined the backup anchor points. One more bolt showed micro-fracturing. He made a decision. "Supervisor, bring me 2 industrial clamps from the stage lift kit. Now." The man sprinted. Whitmore stepped closer to the ladder, heels scraping against the polished floor. "If someone gets hurt, if we do nothing," Marcus interrupted calmly, "they will." Her eyes met his then, stripped of posture, and for the first time, she wasn't looking at a maintenance worker. She was looking at the only person in the room who understood the danger. Dr. Romero moved toward Whitmore. "We need to evacuate fully," she whispered. "And cause a stampede?" Whitmore shot back. Marcus heard them anyway. "No stampede," he said firmly. "Slow release through both side corridors. Keep spacing even." The supervisor returned, breathless, handing up the clamps. Marcus secured himself with one arm and worked with the other, fitting the first clamp across the compromised seam to redistribute the strain temporarily. Sweat beaded along his temple despite the cool air. The auditorium fell nearly silent except for rain and metal strain. He locked the second clamp into place and tightened both carefully, calculating the load shift in his head the way he'd done countless times before, in places far less forgiving than this. Below, someone whispered, "How does he know all this?" The maintenance supervisor answered under his breath, "Because he's not just maintenance." Whitmore heard that too. Marcus tested the grid again with the flat of his palm. The vibration eased slightly, still present, but no longer escalating. "Front section stable for now," he called down. "But this needs full structural review before reopening." Relief rippled visibly through the crowd. Parents hugged children. A few even clapped tentatively before catching themselves. Whitmore didn't clap. She stared at the steel above as if it had betrayed her personally. Marcus descended the ladder slowly, boots steady against the rungs. When he reached the floor, Lena rushed forward despite herself. "You okay?" she breathed. He nodded. I've got it. Rain hammered harder now against the windows, but the interior felt steadier. Dr. Romero approached, voice softer than before. You prevented something serious. He shrugged slightly. I slowed it down. It still needs fixing. Whitmore stepped closer, regaining fragments of composure. We'll conduct an internal investigation, she said carefully. He met her gaze. You should. Around them, the auditorium buzzed with new understanding. The scholarship vote was forgotten entirely. Cameras now pointed at him instead of the podium. The room that had felt too small minutes ago now felt exposed. Not because of him, but because of what his competence revealed. And as emergency crews finally entered to assess the damage, one quiet truth settled over everyone present. The man they'd said didn't belong had just held the building together. Emergency crews moved in with controlled urgency, radios crackling, boots thudding against polished floors that had hosted donors and dignitaries only minutes earlier. Parents were ushered outside beneath the awning as rain poured harder, soaking banners that boasted innovation and excellence. The storm felt almost symbolic now. Nature pressing against glass and steel that hadn't been prepared properly. Marcus stood near the base of the stage ladder, hands resting at his sides, breathing steady. Lena hovered close, her robotics jacket damp at the shoulders where rain had blown in. He squeezed her shoulder gently. You're okay, he murmured. Across the auditorium, Evelyn Whitmore was speaking in hushed but urgent tones to a fire marshal. Her posture had shifted, no longer commanding but defensive. She gestured toward the rigging above, as if distance alone could separate her from responsibility. The maintenance supervisor approached Marcus quietly. You were right about the load imbalance, he said. Fire marshal confirmed microfractures along the west seam. Marcus nodded once. It wasn't installed flush. That's what they're saying. Dr. Romero stepped toward them, heels clicking hesitantly. Mr. She paused, correcting herself. Marcus, I need to understand something. He met her eyes calmly. How did you know? She asked. Before he could answer, Whitmore's voice cut in from behind them. He made an educated guess. Let's not dramatize it. Marcus didn't bristle. He simply looked back at the exposed seam overhead. It wasn't a guess. The fire marshal joined them, clipboard in hand. Who identified the failure point first? The supervisor pointed without hesitation. He did? The marshal studied Marcus. You have structural training. A beat of silence stretched. Lena looked up at her father, waiting. He considered the question, weighing not pride, but consequence. I've worked in environments where load distribution isn't optional, he said carefully. Whitmore crossed her arms. That's vague. It's sufficient, the marshal replied. Because if he hadn't intervened, we'd be evacuating under collapse conditions. The words hung in the damp air. Parents nearby overheard. Whispers started again, but this time they carried a different tone. Whitmore forced a thin smile. We'll conduct a thorough review. This renovation met all compliance standards. The marshal's pen scratched against paper. Compliance doesn't mean correct. Marcus glanced toward the rear of the auditorium where rainwater was beginning to pool near the baseboards. Water intrusion's going to increase lateral stress, he added. You should close the west wing entirely. The marshal nodded. Already in motion. Whitmore's composure thinned further. We cannot shut down the entire renovated section indefinitely. The showcase is over, Romero said quietly. That landed harder than anything else. The principal turned toward the gathering parents beneath the awning. Everyone's safe because someone paid attention, she said, voice steady despite the storm. Let's focus on that. Her gaze drifted briefly to Marcus. Lena stepped closer to him. They were going to vote, she whispered. I know. Are they still? No, he said gently. Not tonight. Whitmore heard that and stiffened. The scholarship discussion is postponed pending review, she announced sharply, reclaiming authority where she could. Pending what review? A parent called out. The building or the bias? The question sliced cleanly through the rain-soaked tension. Whitmore didn't answer. Emergency lights cast the auditorium in a different hue now, less golden, more stark. The polished prestige had been replaced with exposed bolts and caution tape. Reporters who had come to cover the showcase were filming something far more complicated. The maintenance supervisor leaned toward Marcus. You ever going to tell them? He murmured. Tell them what? Marcus asked quietly. What you used to do. He didn't respond. Instead, he looked toward Lena, who stood straighter now, not small, not apologetic, just watching. Whitmore approached him again, lowering her voice so only a few could hear. You've made your point, she said tightly. There's no need to escalate this. He held her gaze. I didn't escalate anything. The wind rattled the glass again, but the building held, for now. Dr. Romero stepped between them slightly, her conflict visible but leaning somewhere new. We'll reconvene after the structural report, she said, and the board will reassess everything. Whitmore's jaw flexed. The board will follow procedure. Romero didn't argue, but she didn't look convinced either. As parents began leaving in clusters, many paused to thank Marcus quietly. A father clasped his hand. A mother squeezed Lena's shoulder. Gratitude moved through the crowd in understated waves. Whitmore noticed, and she noticed something else. Respect. It wasn't loud, it wasn't declared, but it had shifted. The stage that had been prepared for revocation now stood under inspection lights. The scholarship debate had dissolved into something larger than policy. Marcus walked toward the exit with Lena beside him. Rain misted the air beyond the awning, cool against his face. Behind them, the board members huddled tightly around Whitmore, whispering urgently. Damage control wasn't about steel anymore. It was about credibility. As he stepped into the rain, Lena slipped her small wrench from his tool belt and held it for a second before handing it back. You knew, she said softly. He gave the faintest smile. I pay attention. Thunder rolled overhead, not threatening now, just distant. Inside, the auditorium remained standing, but the foundation of something else had cracked wide open. Rain ran in thin rivers along the curb as emergency vehicles idled under flashing lights. Parents drifted toward their cars in stunned clusters, still glancing back at the academy as if expecting it to shift again. Lena stayed close beside him beneath the awning, the night air cool against their skin. A reporter edged closer, microphone half raised. Sir, can you explain how you knew the support line was failing? He didn't slow his steps. I heard something off, he said simply. That's not luck, the reporter pressed. Marcus stopped then, turning just enough to meet the question without feeding it. It's not luck, he agreed. It's experience. Behind him, and inside the taped-off auditorium, Evelyn Whitmore was speaking sharply into her phone. Her voice carried despite the rain. No, I don't care what the marshal thinks. We followed the engineering report. Get me the compliance documents now. The maintenance supervisor stepped outside moments later, water darkening his shoulders. Fire marshals sealing the west wing until full structural analysis, he told Marcus quietly. They're asking who signed off on final load calculations. Marcus nodded once. They'll find it. The supervisor hesitated. You should talk to them. Officially. Before he could respond, a loud crack echoed from inside the building, sharp and splintering. Everyone froze. A second later, the fire marshal burst through the doors. We've got secondary shift in the upper joint, he called. Clear the perimeter. Whitmore stepped out just as the words landed. What now? She demanded. The marshal didn't soften it. The temporary stabilization bought time, but the lateral stress is migrating. We need a precise counterweight adjustment before the next wind gust. His eyes scanned the crowd, then locked onto Marcus. You, he said. You understood the failure pattern? Whitmore stiffened. He's not contracted personnel. He's the only one who's seen it up close, the marshal shot back. Unless you've got a structural engineer hiding in that blazer. The wind surged again, rattling the tall windows violently. Lena grabbed her father's sleeve. Dad. He crouched briefly to meet her eyes. Stay with the supervisor, he said softly. I'll be right there. She swallowed but nodded. Marcus moved back inside without hesitation. The auditorium looked different now, emptier, stripped of audience and illusion. Caution tape fluttered across the front rows. Rainwater traced thin lines down the interior glass. Up above, the seam he'd clamped earlier trembled under shifting load. The first fix had redistributed pressure, but not eliminated the core flaw. The marshal joined him beneath the ladder. Talk me through it. Marcus studied the steel, calculating angles in seconds. The anchor plates pulling against weakened brick, he said. We need to shift tension laterally, temporary brace across the adjacent column. You sure? The marshal asked. Yes. Whitmore entered behind them, heels slipping slightly on damp floor. If you overcorrect... He didn't look at her. If we do nothing, it fails. The marshal made the call. Get me a hydraulic spreader and brace kit. Firefighters moved swiftly. Marcus climbed again, muscles steady despite the adrenaline. Each rung felt solid beneath his boots, familiar in a way that had nothing to do with schools. Halfway up, another memory flashed. Not of auditoriums, but of wind tearing across unstable structures in far harsher environments. He pushed it aside. Focus. At the top, he signaled for the brace. The firefighter handed it up carefully. Angle it 10 degrees inward, Marcus instructed. Not flush, counter the drift. The firefighter adjusted as told. Whitmore watched from below, rainwater dripping from her coat hem. Cameras were still rolling, catching every second. Marcus secured the brace with deliberate precision, tightening bolts evenly. Sweat slid down his temple again, but his hands didn't shake. Pressure, he called down. The marshal studied his instrument, stabilizing, slowly. A long, grinding groan rippled through the grid, then eased. Marcus exhaled. Hold it there, he said. Don't release until permanent reinforcements installed. He descended carefully. When his boots hit the floor, the marshal extended a hand. You ever work in structural response? Marcus wiped his palms on his jeans. Something like that. Whitmore stepped forward before the conversation could deepen. This intervention is noted, she said stiffly, but liability will be reviewed. The marshal looked at her incredulously. Liability? He just prevented a collapse. She didn't answer. Outside, the wind began to taper, rain softening to a steady drizzle. Lena rushed to him the moment he cleared the ladder. You okay? I'm okay, he said, brushing damp hair from her forehead. Around them, firefighters secured equipment while inspectors documented the compromised seam. The prestige banners hung limp now, soaked and heavy. A parent approached hesitantly. "You saved my son's seat," she said, voice trembling. "Thank you." He nodded politely. Whitmore watched that exchange with tightened lips. Respect was accumulating, and she couldn't redirect it. The marshal stepped aside to confer with his team, then returned with a final glance upward. "It'll hold until sunrise," he confirmed. Relief moved through the small group like a shared breath. Marcus looked once more at the stabilized joint, listening, not with fear, but with practiced awareness. The building was safe for the night, but the truth beneath it had just shifted into full view. The building was safe for the night. Temporary braces held the compromised seam in place, while rain tapered to a dull whisper against the glass. Emergency crews began packing equipment, their movements slower now, less urgent. Caution tape stretched across the West Wing entrance, snapping lightly in the wind. Marcus stood beneath the rigging one last time, eyes traveling across the steel as if committing it to memory. Lena waited near the doorway, fatigue finally softening her posture. The fire marshal approached again, clipboard tucked under one arm. "You weren't guessing," he said. "You anticipated the load migration before my team ran the numbers." Marcus didn't respond immediately. "You've done this before," the marshal pressed. A long pause settled between them. "Yes," he said at last. "Where?" "Army Corps of Engineers, structural stabilization, explosive ordnance disposal before that." The words were simple, no embellishment. The marshal's brows lifted slightly. "EOD? 17 years. Whitmore, who had been conferring with a board member nearby, turned sharply. "Excuse me." Marcus didn't look at her. He kept his focus on the marshal. "Retired 5 years ago." The maintenance supervisor exhaled under his breath. "I knew it," he muttered. Whitmore stepped closer, disbelief flickering across her face. "You're telling me you were military engineering?" "Yes." "And you're working maintenance here?" He met her gaze evenly now. "It's honest work." The simplicity of it unsettled her more than any accusation could have. Dr. Romero approached quietly, eyes searching his face. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" she asked. "About what?" he replied. "About your background. About your expertise." Marcus glanced toward Lena before answering. "Because it wasn't relevant to my daughter's math scores." Silence followed that. The marshal nodded once, thoughtful. "Your assessment tonight prevented major injury," he said. "I'll be noting your credentials in the incident report." Whitmore stiffened. "There's no need to dramatize his resume." The marshal's tone cooled. "Ma'am, this isn't drama, this is fact." Wind gusted again, rattling the caution tape. The building held steady. Whitmore folded her arms. "Regardless, the scholarship issue remains separate." Dr. Romero's expression shifted. "Does it?" Whitmore shot her a warning look. Marcus stepped back slightly, disengaging from the tension. "My kid earned her place," he said calmly. "That's all I care about." Lena stepped forward beside him, shoulders squared now instead of hunched. She wasn't hiding behind him anymore. A reporter re-entered cautiously, microphone lowered, but camera still rolling. "Mr. Vale," she began, voice gentler than before. "Why take a maintenance job after a career like that?" He considered the question briefly. "Because sometimes you choose stability over status," he answered. "And sometimes the people you love need you home more than they need you decorated." Lena blinked hard, fighting emotion. Whitmore watched the exchange, aware of how it played on camera. The narrative she'd controlled earlier was slipping through her fingers. The maintenance supervisor leaned toward Marcus again. "You could have told them months ago," he murmured. "Would it have mattered?" Marcus asked quietly. The supervisor didn't answer. Dr. Romero stepped closer to Whitmore, lowering her voice but not enough to avoid being overheard. "We need to reconsider the vote," she said, publicly. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "The scholarship criteria were never about criteria," Romero interrupted softly. "And you know it." That landed harder than the structural groans earlier. Marcus looked up at the reinforced seam once more, ensuring the brace remained steady. The physics made sense now. Temporary equilibrium, long-term correction still required. He understood that dynamic well. Outside, the storm clouds began to break, faint moonlight filtering through thinning clouds. The marshal closed his clipboard. "We'll conduct a full forensic structural review at first light," he announced. "Until then, no one enters the West Wing." Whitmore nodded stiffly, but her eyes lingered on Marcus, measuring him in a way she hadn't before. Not as maintenance, as threat. Because competence witnessed publicly is dangerous to power built on perception. Lena tugged lightly at his sleeve. "Can we go home?" she asked. He looked down at her, exhaustion finally touching his features. "Yeah," he said softly. "We can." As they stepped toward the exit, murmurs followed, not skeptical this time, but respectful. Whitmore remained behind, surrounded by board members whose whispers were no longer confident. Dr. Romero watched Marcus leave, something resolute forming behind her eyes. The building stood, but the balance of authority inside it had shifted. And for the first time, the scholarship debate wasn't about whether Lena belonged. It was about whether the board still did, and the rain had faded to mist by the time they reached the parking lot. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement in long silver streaks. Lena walked quietly beside him, her backpack slung over one shoulder, robotics jacket damp but forgotten. Neither spoke until they reached his old pickup truck. She climbed in first, staring through the windshield at the Academy building still glowing behind caution tape. He slid into the driver's seat and rested his hands on the wheel without turning the engine on. "You didn't tell me," she said softly. "About what?" "About all of that." He leaned back slightly. The truck smelled faintly of oil and sawdust. Familiar, grounded. "It wasn't important." "It feels important," she replied. He studied her reflection in the glass. "What's important is that you earned that scholarship." She hesitated. "They were going to take it. I know. And if the building hadn't—" She trailed off. He didn't rush to fill the silence. Outside, a fire engine pulled away slowly, its red lights fading into the night. "Would you have told them," she asked, "about my past?" He considered it. "Only if it mattered to your future." She turned toward him fully now. "It matters to me." That landed differently. He exhaled, gaze steady. "I did work that required paying attention. High-risk structures, high-risk mistakes. You don't get second chances in those environments." She absorbed that quietly. "Why leave?" she asked. He smiled faintly, not from amusement but memory. "Because sometimes you get tired of calculating worst-case scenarios. And sometimes you realize the person waiting at home is more important than the next mission." Her eyes shimmered slightly, but she blinked it away. Inside the Academy, lights were shutting down section by section. The West Wing remained dark, barricaded. "Are they still going to vote?" she whispered. "Probably," he said honestly. "Just not tonight." She leaned her head back against the seat. "I don't want them to feel sorry for me." "They won't," he said firmly. How do you know? Because what happened tonight wasn't luck, and people saw that. She studied him again. They saw you. He shook his head gently. They saw competence. A beat passed, and they saw you didn't panic, she added. He started the engine at last. Panicking doesn't fix bolts. That pulled the smallest smile from her. As they drove away, the academy receded in the rearview mirror, no longer just a symbol of prestige, but of exposure. Back inside the building, Dr. Romero remained in her office, lights still on. She stared at the structural reports being forwarded to her inbox, then at the scholarship files stacked neatly beside them. Her phone buzzed. A message from a board member. We need to talk before this gets worse. Across town, Evelyn Whitmore sat alone in her home office, replaying footage from a local news feed. The camera angle caught her voice earlier in the evening, sharp, dismissive. Then it cut to Marcus climbing the rigging with steady precision. The contrast was brutal. She muted the video and stared at her reflection in the darkened screen. Power relied on perception. And tonight, perception had shifted. The next morning would bring inspectors, reporters, and likely legal inquiries about the renovation contract. Whitmore Development's name was stamped across the permits. Meanwhile, in a small apartment kitchen lit by a single overhead bulb, Lena spread out her robotics components on the table. "You're still working?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Showcase isn't canceled forever." He leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely. "That's my girl." She paused, then looked up. "If they try to take it again, will you fight?" His answer came without hesitation. "Always." Not loudly, not dramatically, just certain. Outside, wind rustled through trees as the last storm clouds drifted away. The building had survived the night because someone noticed what others ignored. The same might soon be true for the academy itself, and as father and daughter worked quietly in the warm glow of their kitchen light, one truth settled between them. Belonging wasn't granted by a board, it was proven under pressure. Belonging wasn't granted by a board, it was tested. The next morning began without ceremony. Gray light filtered through thin curtains as Marcus stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing coffee from a chipped mug. Lena was already dressed for school, robotics jacket folded neatly over her arm like armor she refused to abandon. "You don't have to go in today," he said. "I want to," she replied. He nodded once. That was enough. By the time they reached the academy, satellite vans lined the curb. Reporters clustered near the entrance, voices hushed but alert. Caution tape still sealed the west wing. The main doors stood open under the watch of inspectors carrying clipboards and laser measuring devices. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, a reporter recognized him immediately. "Sir, Mr. Vale, can we get a statement about last night?" He didn't slow his stride. "The building needs fixing," he said evenly. "That's a statement." "Were you aware of structural flaws before the incident?" Another called out. He paused briefly this time. "I filed a maintenance note 2 weeks ago," he replied. "I'm sure it's in the system." Cameras shifted. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere felt heavier than the night before. Students moved in tight groups, whispering. Teachers kept voices low. The usual polished hum of prestige had thinned into something uncertain. Dr. Romero stood near the front office, eyes tired but steady. When she saw them, she stepped forward. "I'm glad you came," she said quietly. "We weren't going to hide," Marcus replied. Her gaze flickered to Lena. "Your team presentation is postponed until further notice," she explained gently. "But your scholarship status is under review." Lena's shoulders stiffened. "Under review?" Marcus repeated. voice calm but edged. Romero held his gaze. There's pressure from several board members to delay final decisions until the structural investigation concludes. Structural investigation has nothing to do with my daughter's performance, he said. I know, she replied softly, but politics rarely separate cleanly. From across the lobby, Evelyn Whitmore emerged from a closed meeting room. Her posture had returned, controlled, composed, but something brittle lingered beneath it. She approached them with measured steps. Mr. Vale, she began, tone smooth, I hope your daughter is well. She is, he answered. Whitmore glanced briefly at Lena, offering a thin smile. Given the circumstances, the board believes it's prudent to pause all scholarship confirmations until we conclude our internal review. Pause, Lena echoed quietly. It's procedural, Whitmore added quickly. Marcus studied her. Procedural would have been listening when I filed the maintenance report. Whitmore's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. This is not the time to assign blame. It's exactly the time, he replied. The lobby had grown quieter around them. Students slowed their steps. Phones lifted discreetly again. Romero stepped slightly closer, conflict clear on her face. Evelyn, perhaps we should discuss this in private. Whitmore shook her head. Transparency is important. So is fairness, Marcus said. A parent standing near the reception desk spoke up hesitantly. My son was in the front row last night, she said. If he hadn't, she gestured toward Marcus. We wouldn't be having this conversation. Murmurs followed. Whitmore's jaw flexed. We are grateful for Mr. Vale's assistance, she said carefully. However, gratitude does not override governance. Marcus didn't raise his voice. Governance shouldn't override merit. Lena stood straighter beside him. A reporter who had slipped inside edged closer. Board President Whitmore, she asked, is it accurate that Whitmore Development signed off on the West Wing renovation? Whitmore's composure flickered again. That's irrelevant to this discussion. It's not irrelevant to safety, the reporter pressed. Romero exhaled slowly. The board will hold a public session tomorrow evening to address both the structural findings and pending scholarship decisions, she announced, in the interest of transparency. Whitmore shot her a look, but didn't contradict her. Marcus nodded once. Public Works. He turned slightly toward the camera without seeking it. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you earned, he said calmly, remember, proof doesn't need permission. And if you're watching this unfold, subscribe, because what happens tomorrow won't stay quiet. Whitmore stiffened at the subtle shift of narrative. She wasn't controlling the room anymore. The lobby buzzed now, not with gossip, but momentum. Lena squeezed her father's hand briefly before heading toward her classroom. Students stepped aside for her, not out of pity, but respect. Marcus remained near the entrance for a moment longer, eyes scanning the ceiling beams instinctively. Temporary equilibrium. The real test would come under brighter lights. Behind him, Whitmore retreated toward the boardroom doors once more, her steps sharper than before. The building stood steady in the morning calm. But by tomorrow night the pressure wouldn't be on Steele, it would be on her. By the time evening settled over the academy the next day, the lobby no longer buzzed with whispers. It vibrated with expectation. Folding chairs had been arranged in careful rows. News cameras lined the back wall. A printed banner read, Emergency Board Session, Structural Findings and Scholarship Review. Marcus stood near the side corridor instead of the center aisle, hands loosely clasped in front of him. Same boots, same quiet presence. Lena sat in the second row with her robotics teammates, chin lifted, eyes forward. The west wing remained sealed behind temporary barricades. Engineers had spent the day running stress tests, scanning load distribution, and documenting microfractures along the compromised seam. The preliminary report had already circulated online. Whitmore Development's name appeared 3 times in the executive summary. Evelyn Whitmore entered precisely at 7 o'clock. Posture immaculate, expression measured. She took her seat at the center of the board table as if reclaiming territory. Dr. Romero sat 2 chairs down, fingers interlaced tightly. The session began with formalities. Minutes recorded, agenda confirmed. But the air carried none of the usual decorum. Whitmore cleared her throat. "We will begin with the structural report." An independent engineer stepped forward, projector humming softly as diagrams illuminated the screen behind him. Cross-sections of steel beams and anchor plates rotated slowly in clinical clarity. The failure point, the engineer explained, laser pointer circling the compromised seam, was caused by uneven torque application during installation. The anchor bolt was misaligned at initial placement. Under full occupancy load combined with wind pressure, it began shearing. A murmur rippled through the audience. "And the temporary stabilization?" a board member asked. The engineer nodded toward Marcus without naming him. "Intervention prevented progressive collapse." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "Was this flaw detectable prior to the event?" Romero asked carefully. "Yes," the engineer replied. "A trained structural specialist would have flagged the imbalance upon inspection." Several heads turned instinctively toward Marcus. Whitmore interjected. "The building passed compliance inspection." "Compliance review does not equal stress simulation," the engineer responded calmly. A reporter raised her hand. "Is it accurate that Whitmore Development oversaw the renovation contract?" Whitmore inhaled slowly before answering. "My firm partnered with certified contractors. We followed all regulatory protocols. But the misalignment occurred during installation," the engineer added. "Responsibility falls within the renovation oversight chain." Silence followed that. Lena's fingers tightened around the edge of her seat. Whitmore pivoted quickly. "We are not here to conduct a corporate trial," she said. "We are here to address the Academy's integrity moving forward." "Integrity includes accountability," a parent called out. Applause broke out, tentative at first, then stronger. Whitmore's composure thinned but did not shatter. "The scholarship review will now proceed," she announced. The projector screen shifted to a list of student names. Lena's appeared 4th. Whitmore folded her hands. "Given recent events, the board believes it is prudent to reassess all discretionary placements to ensure alignment with institutional standards." Marcus didn't move, didn't interrupt. Romero leaned toward her microphone. "Lena Vale's placement was determined solely on academic merit and competitive examination performance," she stated clearly. "There is no policy-based justification for revocation." Whitmore's voice cooled. "Scholarships also reflect cultural integration and long-term fit." The word "fit" again. A board member beside her shifted uncomfortably. "After last night," he said cautiously, "public perception matters." "Public perception should not dictate governance," Whitmore replied sharply. "No," he agreed, "but it does reflect it." The room hummed with tension. Marcus finally stepped forward, not onto the stage, but just enough to be seen clearly. "May I?" he asked. Whitmore hesitated, then nodded stiffly. He didn't climb ladders tonight. He simply stood at the side aisle, voice even. "My daughter earned her place here," he said. "You all saw what happened last night. You saw competence where you didn't expect it." No one interrupted. You talk about fit, he continued. Fit isn't about background, it's about contribution. She contributes. Now that's measurable. Lena swallowed hard but held her posture. He didn't mention his service, didn't list credentials. The report had done that work quietly through implication. Whitmore regarded him carefully. Your intervention in the structural incident does not exempt your child from evaluation. It doesn't need to, he replied. Romero leaned forward. The vote should reflect merit, nothing more. A board member near the end of the table exhaled. We can't ignore what happened, the optics alone. Optics? Whitmore snapped. This is about standards. And standards were compromised, the engineer interjected gently, by oversight. Another ripple of murmurs. The balance was shifting, not through anger, but through accumulation. Whitmore felt it. Marcus remained still. No raised voice, no dramatic flourish, just presence. Outside, wind brushed softly against the glass facade. The building stood steady under reinforcement. Inside, pressure mounted around the table. Whitmore glanced at the cameras lining the back wall. Public exposure. She understood it now, and she understood something else. The next vote wouldn't be about a scholarship. It would be about her leadership. The room held its breath as Evelyn Whitmore adjusted the microphone in front of her. The faint feedback hum echoed sharper than intended, slicing through the tension that had thickened over the past hour. We will proceed with the vote, she said, voice measured but no longer effortless. Board members shifted in their seats. Papers rustled. Cameras leaned closer. Lena's name remained projected behind them, stark against a white background. Not a statistic, not a case study, a person. Marcus stood at the side aisle, hands steady at his sides. He wasn't pleading, he wasn't posturing. He was simply present. An immovable point in a room that felt increasingly unstable. The first board member cleared his throat. Based on academic records and entrance examination results, I vote to uphold the scholarship. A murmur spread instantly. Whitmore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The second member hesitated before speaking. Given the events surrounding the structural failure and the subsequent review findings, I believe merit should stand independently. I vote to uphold. Applause rippled softly from the audience before being hushed. Whitmore leaned toward her microphone. Let's remain orderly. But order no longer felt like hers to command. The third board member adjusted her glasses. I support maintaining standards, she began carefully, glancing at Whitmore, and in this case the standard was met. I vote to uphold. 3 votes. Romero exhaled quietly. Whitmore's composure began to fracture at the edges. We cannot allow emotional influence to override governance, she said firmly. This academy's reputation was protected last night by someone you tried to dismiss. A parent interrupted from the back row. The words landed hard. Whitmore looked toward the voice, but the crowd no longer shrank under her gaze. The fourth board member spoke. The renovation oversight failure reflects on leadership, he said evenly. The scholarship decision reflects on fairness. They are connected, whether we like it or not. I vote to uphold. 4. A shift moved through the room. Not loud, but decisive. Whitmore's hands tightened around her papers. She was calculating now, not control, but damage. There is still my vote, she said, voice cooling. Everyone watched her. She glanced briefly at Lena, then at Marcus. Cameras captured every second. For the record, Whitmore began slowly, I maintain that institutional fit is a valid consideration. The engineer seated along the wall shifted slightly, visible reminder of the report projected minutes earlier. But, she continued, tone forced into neutrality, in light of the board majority and to avoid further division, I will not oppose the decision. A subtle gasp moved through the audience. Lena Vale's scholarship is upheld. The words hung in the air. Applause erupted, not explosive but sustained. Not charity, recognition. Lena's breath hitched. She didn't cry. She simply straightened, as if something heavy had been lifted from her shoulders. Marcus closed his eyes for half a second, relief controlled, not dramatic. Whitmore shuffled her papers sharply. "This concludes the scholarship review," she said. "The structural investigation remains ongoing." A reporter stood immediately. "President Whitmore, will you address the findings tying renovation oversight to your firm?" Her composure wavered again. "The investigation is active," she replied. "I will not speculate." "Will you step aside during the review?" another reporter pressed. Silence. Romero looked at Whitmore carefully, not hostile, but resolute. Whitmore inhaled slowly, weighing optics against authority. "For the sake of transparency," she said at last, each word deliberate, "I will temporarily recuse myself from board leadership pending review." The statement hit harder than the vote. The audience stirred again, this time not with applause but with stunned acknowledgement. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply walked forward until he stood beside Lena's row. She turned toward him. "It's over?" she whispered. "For now," he replied gently. Whitmore gathered her belongings with controlled movements, though her shoulders no longer carried the same certainty. She stepped down from the center chair, and for the first time, someone else occupied it, Romero, reluctantly but firmly. Public exposure had done what private confrontation never could. Not through shouting, through visibility. As board members began filing out, several parents approached Marcus again, not as spectacle, but as neighbor. "Thank you," one father said quietly. He nodded. "Keep asking questions," he replied. Outside, night air felt lighter than it had in days. The academy's facade stood illuminated, reinforced beams visible behind temporary supports. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest now. Inside, Romero addressed the remaining audience. "This institution will move forward with full accountability," she said, "and with renewed commitment to fairness." The words felt less like promise and more like correction. Marcus placed a steady hand on Lena's shoulder. Belonging had never been theirs to grant. But tonight it had been reclaimed, in full view of everyone who once doubted it. Belonging had never been theirs to grant, but tonight it had been reclaimed, in full view of everyone who once doubted it. The auditorium emptied slowly, the energy no longer tense but reflective. Folding chairs scraped softly against the floor as families gathered coats and bags. The projector screen went dark, Lena's name disappearing from the wall, but not from memory. Marcus remained near the aisle, allowing the crowd to thin before moving. Lena stood beside him, robotics jacket zipped halfway now, chin lifted in a way that felt different from before. Not defensive, certain. Dr. Romero stepped down from the board table, the temporary center chair still slightly out of alignment from where Whitmore had vacated it. She approached them without the distance she'd kept before. "I owe you both an apology," she said quietly. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "For what?" "For not speaking sooner," she replied, "for allowing the conversation to drift into fit." Lena met her eyes. "I fit," she said simply. Romero nodded. "You do." Across the room, reporters clustered around Whitmore near the exit. Flashbulbs flickered against her controlled expression as she delivered measured, cautious statements about transparency and review. The power she once radiated now felt negotiated rather than assumed. One reporter broke away and approached Marcus. "Sir," she said, voice gentler than before, "would you like to comment on the recusal?" He considered the question, glancing once toward Lena before answering. "Leadership means owning outcomes," he said calmly. "That applies to buildings and decisions." The reporter nodded, scribbling quickly. Another parent stepped forward, hand extended. "My daughter's on the robotics team," she said. "She told me Lena helped her debug code last month. I didn't realize." She trailed off. Embarrassed, Marcus shook her hand firmly. "You do now." The parent smiled faintly and turned to Lena. "See you at practice." After she left, Lena looked up at her father. "They're different tonight." "People adjust when truth's visible," he said. Near the doorway, the maintenance supervisor caught his eye and gave a subtle nod, respect without spectacle. Romero lingered a moment longer. "The structural review will likely extend for weeks," she said quietly. "There will be scrutiny." "There should be," Marcus replied. She hesitated. "If you're willing, I'd value your input on future safety evaluations." He didn't answer immediately. The weight of that offer wasn't lost on him. "I'll think about it," he said finally. She accepted that and stepped away. Outside, cool night air brushed against their faces as they exited the building together. The academy lights glowed steady against reinforced beams. Temporary supports still lined the west wing like visible reminders of oversight corrected. Lena paused at the top of the steps. "You didn't say much in there," she observed. "I said enough." "You could have told them everything," she added, "about what you've done." He looked at her carefully. "It wasn't about proving who I was." "It kind of was," she said. A faint smile touched his face. "No, it was about proving who you are." She absorbed that in silence. Behind them, reporters continued circling Whitmore near the parking lot. Her voice carried faintly through the night. Controlled, but defensive. Questions about oversight, accountability, corporate responsibility. The narrative had shifted beyond scholarship. Marcus glanced once more at the building facade. Steel and brick. Old and new. Reinforced under pressure. "Dad?" Lena said softly. "Yeah? Did it feel like before, up there?" He knew what she meant. "For a second," he admitted, "but this time I wasn't calculating worst-case scenarios for strangers. I was protecting what matters." She nodded slowly. A group of students exited laughing, relieved, lighter. They waved at Lena as they passed. She waved back without hesitation. No shrinking, no apology, just presence. Marcus walked beside her toward the truck, boots steady against the pavement. The night felt quieter now, not empty, but settled. Behind them, the academy doors closed gently. Temporary braces would remain for weeks. Structural audits would dissect every oversight. Board leadership would reorganize. But something intangible had already been repaired. Elena unlocked the truck door and paused before climbing in. "Thanks," she said. "For what?" "For not letting them decide who we are." He met her eyes evenly. They never could. As they drove away, the academy receded once more in the rearview mirror. Not as a battleground now, but as a place recalibrating itself. Pressure had revealed fractures, and fractures, once exposed, can be reinforced. The scholarship had been upheld. Accountability had begun, and the quiet man they'd underestimated walked away without triumph, only dignity intact, steady as steel under proper load. Morning sunlight poured through the apartment window, softer than the storm-lit glare of the past 2 days. Lena sat at the kitchen table again, robotics components spread neatly in front of her, fingers moving with renewed focus, and the tension that once hovered over her shoulders had dissolved into concentration. Marcus leaned against the counter, coffee in hand, watching her work without interrupting. "They moved practice to the East Lab," she said, not looking up. "West Wing's staying closed until full reinforcement." "Good," he replied. "Do it right the second time." She smiled faintly. "Dr. Romero asked if you'd consult on safety improvements." He took a slow sip before answering. "She did? Are you going to?" He considered the question carefully. "Maybe," he said, "if it helps." Lena tightened a small screw with deliberate precision. "You always say that." "Say what?" "That if it helps." He set his mug down. "That's kind of the point." A quiet moment passed between them, not heavy, not fragile, just steady. Across town, headlines were circulating. Board, President, recuses. After structural oversight revealed. Scholarship vote sparks transparency debate. The story had grown beyond a single comment in an auditorium. It had become a conversation about standards, real ones. Whitmore's resignation as acting chair was announced by noon. Official language framed it as temporary during investigation, but everyone understood what it meant. Power, once assumed, had been questioned publicly. At the academy, Dr. Romero addressed students during homeroom. "Excellence," she said clearly, "is not defined by background, it's defined by contribution." Lena heard that and didn't look down. That afternoon, as they walked toward the truck after school, a group of students called her name. Not to whisper, not to mock. To ask about robotics design. Belonging felt different now. It felt earned and visible. Marcus opened the truck door and paused before getting in, glancing back once more at the academy facade. Permanent reinforcement beams were already being installed, steel brighter against older brick. Pressure had exposed weaknesses. Accountability had followed. He didn't need applause. Didn't need recognition plaques or public praise. What he needed was simple. His daughter walking through those doors without shrinking. She climbed into the passenger seat, fastening her seatbelt with quick, confident motion. "They're reviewing scholarship policies," she said. "Making them merit only." "Good," he replied. "And they're starting a student safety committee." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "You joining?" "Already did." That pulled a quiet laugh from him. The road ahead stretched open as he pulled away from the curb. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just real. For years, he had lived where power never looked. Service corridors, maintenance ladders, spaces meant for labor instead of leadership. But when the structure trembled, those spaces became his ground. He hadn't stepped forward to prove worth. He'd stepped forward because someone needed to, and sometimes that's enough to change a room. If this story moved you, ask me for the next story title and we'll tackle it together. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. The bouncer mocked the single dad's old jacket until a black SUV pulled up behind him. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?